Opposite colored bishops. What does this mean? Usually this entails a draw, but only if there's nothing else on the board. While there are major pieces on the board or other pieces as well, the opposite colored bishop's dynamic becomes much more nuanced, and usually the attacking side is the one that wins. And in this game, this was a very good example of exactly this. This was a game between Alexei Shirov and Anish Giri, two very strong players. Shirov has been in the top two rating spots for quite a while ago. And the Giri, well, he needs no introduction. So this was a game from the currently played European Team Chess Championship in Batumi, Georgia. And this was round 5 between Spain and the Netherlands. And Giri scored a very nice win with the black pieces against Shirov. So let's take a look what happened here. So e4, c5, and a few moves later we have the Najdorf Sicilian. So this is of course the most popular Sicilian. It's a very good opening, and it's very challenging, and black plays for the full point right from the beginning. Of course, Giri has made a course on the Najdorf, and he is known as a good theoretician, so he is not scared of going into these sharp positions, even against such a strong attacker such as Alexei Shirov. So Shirov has of course played these positions for many years as well, so they're both quite well versed. So bishop e3, now of course there are other variations as well, like bishop g5, there's some positional variations with bishop e2 and castles, but Shirov is a principal player. e5, knight b3, bishop e6, f3, and this move prepares an eventual g4. So Giri plays the move h5, which is the modern treatment of this position. The main move used to be bishop e7, but a few years later this has become popular, gaining space on the king side. This may look strange because we are going to castle kingside. This also allows the bishop to park itself on g5, potentially fighting for the d5 square. But the ancients have pointed out that this is quite fine for black, and this makes it a bit harder for white to find a plan, because the obvious g4 is not as easy to play. So Shirov played knight d5, bishop takes d5, and knight b d7. So now we have arrived at this structure, and in theory the plans are as follows. So white should try to play c4, c5, usually to create a passed pawn on the d file, because he has a 4-3 majority on the queen side, while black usually plays on the king side with his 4-3 majority here. In practice this is usually not the case, as white usually castles queenside and tries to attack with an eventual f4, or even with the king on the queen side, he tries to still play something like c4 at a good moment. So queen d2 and g6. So this move prepares the bishop's development to g7, but also in some positions to h6 as well. As we will see, this becomes a possibility at some point as well. So Shirov castles, and Giri plays the move bishop g7, which was prepared by g6, but this is not the most popular move in this position. The most popular move is knight b6, and here there are a lot of theoretical variations which usually end in theoretical draws between masters. For example, king b1, and black takes this pawn. After bishop g5, even though the d5 pawn is gone, white has a lot of pressure on the d file, and now this weakness on d6 has been exposed. And some theory might go as follows: bishop e7, because currently queen takes d5 was a threat. After recapturing, white would take the queen and then take the knight on d5. So bishop e7, bishop d3, queen c7, rook he1, knight b6, a4. And there are other moves as well, queen f2 as well. And in the Masters database, if you check this position, most of the games will end in draws, because both players are usually quite well prepared. So generally, black is a pawn ahead, but white has good compensation because of the two files in the center, and the black's king is not entirely safe. So the position is more or less okay. So instead, bishop g7 is played, which is a more obvious move and a simpler move. Perhaps Giri did not want to go down the drawish paths. So now h3 by Shirov. After quite a while of thinking, the main move here was king b1, quite kind of a waiting move, and from here black can play a variety of ways. and usually black tries to play b5, at some point queen c7. The problem is this knight may come to c6 when the b-pawn gets pushed, but as we will see in the game, this is usually not a big issue. For example, queen c7 can be played, bishop e2. If we castle, we will always have to think about g4, which is perhaps a bit scary, but instead we can, for example, play b5, though here after knight a5 the knight is coming to c6, but this is not a very big issue. So there are of course other ways to play, but this is the general concept that black follows. So h3, the idea is at some point to play g4, and against h3 in such positions the usual reaction is h4, because this forever stops g4, because whenever black takes back, white's pawns will be isolated and it will be quite difficult to create anything on the king side. Though here this pawn might become a weakness at some point. For example, queen b4 is an interesting move, attacking this pawn and keeping an eye on this one as well. And for example, after queen c7, white can get some initiative here. For example, b5, now even c4, which seems a bit crazy, but the king will go to b1 and the rook will go to c1, and while black's rooks are not connected, black has a little bit of problems to solve. So h4 would be the probably most obvious move, but even though g4 is not really an issue at the moment, black decides to play b5, which is a fine move as well. The point is now that if g4, we can simply take, because the rook on h1 is undefended. For example, after this, we can take this pawn. And we have not castled, so the rook is doing a good job on the h-file. So instead, knight a5 is played, going for this c6 square, knight b6, attacking the pawn on d5, and this pawn will be quite hard to defend. So black's idea is that the knight can come to c6 with tempo for the moment, but it will not hurt very much, because the d5 pawn will have to be defended, and the only way to defend it will be to give up this bishop, which is somewhat of a win for black as well. So here probably king b1 should be played, and at some point white will start pushing g4, so black should probably play h4, for example knight c6, queen c7, and we could get something similar as in the game, with bishop taking the knight on b6, but there are other moves as well, such as c4, which again might look strange to the untrained eye, but white after all has a majority on the queen side, so he is not scared to open up the c-file, because he will be first to get there. So knight c6 is played here, queen c7, and now this pawn is hanging, and when this pawn drops, the knight is not going to be stable anymore, so white has to take this knight, and here we get this position in which we already have a situation with opposite colored bishops, but there are still a lot of pieces on the board, knights as well, all of the heavy pieces are on the board, so the winning side will be the one that gets to play their attack more effectively. Here white plays king b1, not only a useful prophylactic move, but concretely there is a big threat of bishop h6, skewering the queen and the king, so white basically has to play this move, and now we can see the benefits of the move h5 and not castling and leaving the rook on h8. So king b1. Now black plays this move a5, which is not only with the idea to attack on the king side, but also it has ideas of stopping the move queen a5, which would exchange queens, and if the queens are exchanged, white will have an easy plan with c4 at some point to attack the weaknesses on b5 and a6. For example, here queen a5 is a possibility. For example, if we exchange, this is quite decent for black as he can get play quite fast, but if c4 is allowed, then this will not be very good. Otherwise, bishop d3 is probably a bit more accurate here, to simply go and attack, and if a5, g4, white is probably first to create threats here. This knight is not only stopping black's play on the c-file and the queen side, but also there are some ideas of knight e7, maybe even sacrificing something on g6 to open up the position on the king side. So instead a5 is played, controlling the squares and also not allowing some ideas with g4, because again g4 is not that dangerous with the rook on h8, and the king is currently quite fine on this square. So a3 is played. Now Shirov starts playing passively. Currently, there's not that many ways to improve white's position, because if bishop d3, then, well, this pawn is not really hanging because of bishop e4, and this is very problematic. But for example, after b4, black has simple plans such as knight d5 and knight c3, or the more obvious castles and the knight d5. For example, here, this is already a threat. For example, if g4, I'm pretty sure we can take this pawn, and now this does not work because of the nice check knight c3. Because if white takes, then this discovered attack not only wins the queen, but also will give checkmate on the b2 square. So Shirov likely saw something like this, and decided to start putting pawns on dark squares to mitigate black's control of the dark squares, and to support his own bishop, which might go to c2 eventually. Maybe c3 was a bit more accurate, stopping b4, because now white would gladly take this pawn, and the only open file on the a file is not that important. So a3 has a similar idea. Now black decides to castle. Playing h4 is also an idea, but Giri decided that g4 here is not very strong and he can ignore it, but g4 is played nonetheless, as white really has to play on the king side. Rook f8. So this looks like a mysterious move, but black is improving his pieces. Now the rook is on the e file, potentially playing e4, and the rook can't really go anywhere else. If the rook goes to the c file, not only is it blocked anyway, but there's also a check on e7, picking up the rook. So rook f8, and white plays the move g5. But this is perhaps a strategic error, as it gets rid of the tension without allowing white to get anything in return. Probably he should play bishop d3 with the idea to keep pressure on the king side, and now this knight cannot go anywhere, because if g takes h5, black would always like to recapture with the knight, otherwise the g file would get opened. Though here as well it's not that clear. For example, b4, white would have to close the position with a4, and now black has a good idea, which I'm not going to spoil because it happened in the game as well. So g5 was played, knight d7, so now the knight moves. The knight wasn't really doing anything here anyway, as it cannot really take on d5 at any point. So after g5, knight d7, now surprisingly black has quite clear play on the queen side, while white's plan is not that obvious. For example, white does not really want to play f4, because this would really open up this bishop, and it wouldn't really achieve much for white, as on the f file there's not much happening in the near future. So it's not that clear what to do. So bishop d3 is played, and now black plays the star move of the game. So when we have opposite colored bishops, the most important part of the position is who is attacking. And at the moment, white is kind of looking at black's king side, but the g6 pawn is not really a weakness. White would love to get to the f7 square, but it's impossible due to the structure. This pawn on d5 is really obstructing the bishop, and currently this bishop is blocked by this pawn. So Giri finds a simple solution to this problem. He plays e4, which is a great move, sacrificing the pawn basically just for the diagonal, but also to get this square for the knight. And after Shirov takes it, now another nice move, knight e5, exchanging knights, either taking here or trying to involve knight takes e5, bishop e5, which happened in the game. And Shirov took on e5, but this is a mistake, after which defending the position becomes extremely difficult. An instructive move for white here is bishop e2. The point is now that white is giving up the c6 pawn on purpose, just to get rid of this pawn on d5, because it is not only blocking the d file, it is also potentially blocking this diagonal on which this bishop would really like to go to eventually. For example, here, if black just takes the pawn, we can take here, and after queen e4, the bishop is now alive. Of course, black has play on the open files, but white's bishop can eventually also join the attack, and now that the position has opened up, black's advantage is not that obvious. instead what happens is Shirov takes. But now if we look at this position, even though white is a pawn ahead, black is basically winning strategically and positionally because he has the pawn break of b4 eventually, while white does not have any targets on the king side. The h5 pawn, you can kind of try to sacrifice something, but it's not really realistic. g6 is impossible to get to, and f7 is also impossible to attack with this bishop. So even though white is a pawn ahead, black is basically a piece ahead, because this bishop not only defends the king side, but it attacks the queen side as well, which is a lot more important than the pawn. And this position is very far from a draw. So rook h to f1, trying to attack on f7, rook e to b8, preparing b4, rook f3, trying to double on the f-file, but also defending the queen side. And here Giri played a nice move, queen d8, which has the subtle idea of playing queen e8 and then b4 to not allow white to respond with a4, closing the queen side. For example, if here b4 is played, white would definitely play a4. And here black is also doing well if he finds specifically queen d4, attacking checkmate. After queen c1, rook a7. Somehow black is going to break through here as well, but it's not that clear. How? Because if b3, c3 will always happen, most likely. But here the idea is to play the queen to e8 and then b4, and this would simply not allow the reply of a4. So king a2 is played after a long think. Shirov understood the threat to his position, and king a2 is a nice move. After queen e8, the best move, very surprisingly here, for white is the insane move king b3, which looks highly provocative, but the idea is quite simple: to defend the square on a4. Now with b4, white will be able to play a4, and surprisingly, black has no advantage here. There is really no real way to break through, according to the engine. Black can still double on the c-file, try to sacrifice a rook somewhere, so black has chances, but it's not that clear. And surprisingly, this was not found. Also with a4 we just go back, and now b4 will be hard to play. White will play c3 on the next move. So rook b1 is played, which is a more natural move, but this allows the move b4, which Giri plays, and now the pawn break is in motion. White is not really capturing here because this would open the position. So, and a4 is impossible due to this maneuver of queen e8. So bishop f1 is played. Now rook a7, Giri starts doubling on the c-file, and here black has the big threat of queen c8, not only attacking the pawn on c2, but also the pawn on h3 in some positions. For example, after queen c8, bishop d3 would not be possible because of queen takes h3, because the rook is now cut off due to this bishop on d3. So this is a very subtle move, and the pawn on h3 is surprisingly quite important. If white ever pushes it to h4, in an eventual endgame it might be picked off quite easily, after which this pawn will also be quite weak. So for example, if in this position, if we took off all the major pieces, it is quite likely that black's position is simply winning because of the weak king side. And otherwise, if we pick off this pawn, black will have another strength, which is the passed h-pawn. So c3 is played by white, but unfortunately this loses the game. It was already quite hard to defend. The engine suggests moves like bishop a6, simply stopping the move queen c8. Black would have to come up with a different plan here. For example, taking here. After rook takes a3, maybe bishop g7, looking at this pawn as well. Queen g5, at some point we might even attack here. And black is of course still a lot better because he is the only one attacking on the queen side, while white has no counterplay. But c3 is played, but this now allows black to take on c3, creating a weakness on the c3 square. White takes the rook and takes back, and white is still a pawn ahead, but black has succeeded in opening up the king's position. Now queen c8, c3 is undefendable, and after rook c1, black went and took this pawn quite quickly, but surprisingly this is not the most accurate way to play. The engine says that this pawn will get dropped off eventually anyway, and it is a bit more important to play the move a4, to take away the b3 square from the white king or any pieces, and perhaps use it for our own major pieces, like this or like this. And surprisingly, white doesn't really have a way to improve his position in the meanwhile. He can try to defend this pawn, but this pawn was quite important to shield the king from this bishop. Now after rook b7, the position is very hard to play. For example, after this, even exchanging and playing queen c5 is completely winning for black, because again, black is basically a piece ahead. This bishop has no part in this game, while this bishop is controlling the whole board, and eventually black will either play queen b6 or queen a3 or queen g1, and black has control of all the dark squares, so there's not that much to see from white's perspective. So bishop c3 instead is played, and now queen d3, the final mistake probably. Well, not the final, but we will see. Here queen e3 had to be played. The difference between these moves is that this one does not block this bishop, and this bishop has a potential future on the b5 square, maybe playing a4 as well to at least block the a file. Here, for example, if a4 now, the bishop has a simple job of attacking this pawn, and here the engine suggests to move the bishop and exchange rooks, give up this pawn on a4. And for example, in a position like this, of course it is black playing for the win, threatening checkmate, attacking all the pawns on the light squares, but white can kind of survive here according to the engine. Of course, in practice it seems kind of undefensible for white, but objectively this should have been considered more. Because the problem with queen d3 now is not the move that Giri played rook c5, but instead again this nice move a4, again putting a question to what white is going to do. Now this bishop is blocked by the queen, so it cannot go to b5, and if the queen goes to b5, then after bishop e5, white is not really in time to pick up this pawn. For example, after this, if he goes here, after queen c3, this is just going to be checkmate, because queen b2 or queen a1 is impossible to stop, so the game is more or less over. On the worst case, black will pick off the bishop on f1. So instead, rook c5 is played. Now queen a6, which is a natural move, trying to take off the queens. If the queens are exchanged, white is suddenly already quite fine, because his biggest weakness was the king, and without the queens on the board, this weakness is not as emphasized. Instead, here white should have played bishop e2. The idea is again to involve this bishop in the game, mainly with bishop d1, and then either bishop b3 or bishop a4, to firstly not allow the move a4, cramping down on these squares, but also just to get a bishop into the game, as currently on this diagonal it's not really helping. And surprisingly, it's not that easy to win. For example, queen c7, bishop d1, and the engine doesn't really find the way to break through with black. Perhaps with a higher depth it would win, but currently it's sitting on -1.5, which is of course very good, but it's not exactly winning, and the black still needs to find a way to make progress. Said queen a6, but Giri does not really want to trade queens, unsurprisingly, queen c7, and now the threat is bishop e5 to exchange rooks and invade with the queen. So rook c2 is played, now queen b8. The idea is to move the bishop, and if white takes this rook, then this is checkmate. So queen d3 is played, bishop e5. The rook cannot be taken due to queen b2. After queen d1, black finally plays this move a4, which threatens checkmate in one move with queen b3. So white sees this, queen b1. Of course, at the moment, white is basically out of time. Giri has plenty of time to play with, and the position as well is hopeless. After rook c2 and queen b6, Shirov actually just resigns, because the obvious threat is queen d4, after which it is basically impossible to play, because there is a threat of queen a1, for example bishop e2, as you can't really move the queen anywhere due to queen b2. So after this, queen d4, the threat is this, and you can try to defend like this, but now this pawn gets picked off. After bishop c4, defending this, black can play in a variety of ways. Maybe he's not winning on the spot, but after king g7, It's simply impossible to find a move for white, as the queen cannot really go anywhere because it has to defend the bishop. Queen f1, there is queen c2. The bishop can't really move anywhere because it has to defend the pawn. Not to mention, if black wants, he can go pick off these pawns as well. So the position is hopeless, so white resigned after queen b6. And hopefully this was a very instructive display of how opposite colored bishops really do not mean a draw. But if the king is weak, then the attacking side is the one that wins.